Good evening. I'm Jean Shaheen. I'm the director here at the Institute of Politics, and I want to welcome all of you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We have a very special guest with us this evening. Our speaker tonight is a renowned historian of American political history. In 1967, she served as a White House fellow to Lyndon B. Johnson during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. She went on to write Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, which the New York Times reviewer called the most penetrating political biography he had ever read. Well, as you might expect, that book made the bestseller list, and her books have been fixtures on the bestseller list for the past quarter century. The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, which was made into an ABC miniseries, was published in 1987, and her book, No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, The Home Front in World War II, won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1995. That's my personal favorite, I have to say. While growing up in Brooklyn, New York, and then Rockefeller Center, Long Island, she fell in love with baseball. She wrote a book about her love for the Dodgers in 1997, Wait Till Next Year, a memoir. She studied at Colby College, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude, before going on to receive her PhD here at Harvard. As a professor of government at Harvard during the 1970s, she taught a course on the American presidency, while also assisting then former President Lyndon Johnson in the preparation of his memoirs. She is a frequent political commentator for NBC News and has served as a consultant for numerous PBS documentaries, such as Kim Burns' History of Baseball. More on that later. Her latest work is Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. She writes of Lincoln, and I quote, "His political genius was not simply his ability to gather the best men of the country around him, but to impress upon them the purpose, perception, and resolution at every juncture." Team of Rivals is the winner of the Lincoln Prize and the inaugural Book Prize for American History, in addition to being a 2006 National Book Critics Circle Award finalist and New York Times bestseller. Now, she's a woman of many accomplishments, but one of her most unique is that she was the first woman ever to enter the Boston Red Sox locker room. We had to share that. We are proud to have her serve as a member of the Institute of Politics Senior Advisory Committee, and we are honored to welcome Doris Kearns Goodwin to the forum. Before I ask her to come to the podium, we rehearsed this, and it just, sometimes they don't work. I wanted to just tell you the format for this evening's program, because Doris is going to make some opening remarks on her book, and then Professor David Gergen, who is the director of the Kennedy School Center for Public Leadership and also a great friend of the forum, is going to host a conversation with Doris. After that, we will open up the floor for questions and answers from the audience. Doris, we are very excited that you're here with us this evening.
Thank you. While it is true that I was the first woman writing articles about the Red Sox in the Red Sox locker room, it's not clear that I was the first woman in the Red Sox locker room. Who knows what went before me? Anyways, it is a great pleasure to talk to you tonight about this man, Abraham Lincoln, with whom I have lived for the past 10 years. When I decided to live with Lincoln 10 years ago, I must say it was a rather frightening prospect. For one thing, so many more other people had lived with him over the years, and I was worried about whether I could come up with my own angle for the story. At first, I thought I would do for Abraham and Mary Lincoln what I had been able to do, hopefully, for Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, to write about their relationship. But I soon discovered that Mary couldn't carry the public side of the story the way that Eleanor Roosevelt could. And I realized that Lincoln was spending even more time with these various characters in his cabinet, that he was sharing with them the worries about the war, listening to the telegraphs as it was coming over at night in terms of the emotional relationship of waiting until the news would come that 30,000, 40,000 people had been killed, traveling to the fronts, spending time relaxing, that in many ways he was married to them more than Mary. And then when I realized that they had actually been his rivals in the presidential nomination campaign, I finally realized about 2 years into this 10-year story that I had the angle that I wanted for my story, the team of rivals. But there was the added problem of the fact that Lincoln was so old, and by that I mean that I couldn't interview anyone to talk to about him, as I had been able to do with all my other stories. With the Kennedy family still alive, I was able to talk to many of them about what it was like to be part of that family. And with even the Roosevelts, there were dozens of people who had worked in the White House or who knew the Roosevelts. And with Lyndon Johnson, I had the extraordinary experience of having spent so many hours with him in those last years of his life as he tried to sort out what had happened to his life and how the Vietnam legacy had cut his own hopes for being remembered in history in two. I'd been able to attend picnics with him by the lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Baines Johnson, talk to him many, many hours, and I knew there'd be no picnics with Abraham Lincoln, nor would I know anyone who had ever known him. But I found something even more valuable than those personal interviews, and that was that Lincoln's generation kept diaries and wrote thousands of letters to one another. And I think for an historian, there's nothing more treasured than to be able to read a handwritten entry to a diary or a letter that was written at the end of the Civil War. Somehow, in the end of the days, these cabinet members would sit down and write 8 or 10-page letters to their wives and their children describing what had happened that day. In fact, in the Seward family archives, Seward becoming his Secretary of State, there were 5,000 letters in the family. Seward's daughter, Fanny, when she was 16 years old, vowed that she wanted so much to be a writer that she would never marry. She started a diary which began when the Civil War began, ended when the Civil War ended, and she herself died of tuberculosis at the age of 21 years old. Chase, who became his Secretary of the Treasury, kept a diary from the days when he was 18 or 19 years old until months before he died. Bates, who became his Attorney General, had an extraordinary diary from the time he was a young man until days before he died. So somehow all of these sources allowed me, I think, to feel what it must have been like to go through the days with these characters as they surrounded Lincoln during the Civil War. Now, I've been asked what surprised me the most about the Lincoln that emerged from all these treasured primary sources. And I think what I would answer is that it was his vibrant personality. The pictures that we see of him are so stiff with that unfortunate beard that I wish he had never, ever grown. In fact, it was embarrassing. At the beginning of my book tour, I happened to see a picture of him before the beard, and I mentioned that he looked sexy in the picture, so I was teased about that through the entire book tour. But nonetheless, they never smiled in those old 19th century pictures. And then in addition to that, we all know that he had a certain melancholy temperament, probably from birth. But the Lincoln that I uncovered and that was really there from all these people's letters and diaries was a man full of life. Surely he had this temperament, but he had a wonderful array of understandings of his own moods so that he knew how to shake his sadnesses by telling a story, by being humorous, by being with people, by conversing with people. He was full of warmth, and he possessed an extraordinary gift, I think, for oral stories that really sustained the spirits of his colleagues during the darkest days of the war. He was the one that sustained their spirits rather than the other way around. I think that storytelling ability was revealed very early on when he was on the circuit, when he was a young lawyer in Illinois. All of these guys, as lawyers, used to travel together in Illinois, the lawyers, the judges, the bailiffs, the sheriffs, from one county courthouse to the other, trying cases. And when anyone knew that Lincoln was in town, they would come from miles around to listen to him tell stories as he would sit with or stand with his back to a fire and entertain them for hours. And somehow these stories are not quite what you might expect from our marble monument in Washington. One of my favorite stories that he loved to tell over and over again had to do with the Revolutionary War hero, Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen, he said, went to England after the Revolutionary War, and the English people were still upset about losing the war, so they decided to humiliate him by putting a picture of General George Washington in the outhouse where he would have to encounter it. They thought he'd be upset by the idea that Washington was in an outhouse. But he comes out of the outhouse, and instead of being upset, he's smiling. So as Lincoln tells the story, they said to him, "Well, didn't you see George Washington there?" "Oh, yes," he said. "I think it's the perfectly appropriate place for him." "What do you mean?" they said. "Well," he said, "there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington." So you can imagine that if Lincoln would tell such a story before a troubled cabinet meeting, relaxation would ensue. I believe early on that he was aware of possessing unusual talents, burning with a desire to learn, and yet only able to attend school, as he later said, a few weeks here, a few weeks there. All told, he was only in school 1 year of formal schooling, and yet he scoured the countryside for books. I mean, all of us who've read about him, I think when we were young in those blue books on biography, there's an emotional identification with this young child reading by candlelight, trying to find whatever he could to educate himself. The great poet Emily Dickinson once said, "There is nothing like a frigate to take us lands away." In a certain sense, books become a frigate to take Lincoln away from that frontier society in which he grew up. Though he never would go to England, he traveled with Shakespeare's plays to London. He traveled with Lord Byron's poetry to Spain and Portugal. In many ways, literature allowed him to transcend his surroundings. It was said when he got a copy of the King James Bible or Aesop's Fables, he was so excited he couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. But there were so many losses in his early life that he was haunted by death. His mother died when he was 9 years old. His beloved sister Sarah died a few years later in childbirth. His first love, Anne Rutledge, died at 22, not many years after that. And when his mother was dying, she didn't offer him the solace that was so prevalent at that time by promising him that they would meet in an afterlife. She simply said to him, "Abraham, I am going away from you now, and I shall never return." And as a result, it seemed that he became haunted by the idea that when you die, dust simply becomes dust. He couldn't bear that thought. So he seemed to go back to his readings and adopt an ancient Greek notion that if you could accomplish something worthy in your life, your story would be told after you die. You would live on in the memory of others. I believe that worthy ambition, which was so much larger than simply office or power, became his lodestar. It carried him through his one significant depression when he was in his early 30s, when three things had combined to lay him low. He had broken his engagement to Mary Todd Lincoln, not certain he was ready to be married, but knowing he'd hurt her terribly by breaking the engagement. His greatest friend, Joshua Speed, was leaving Illinois to go back to Kentucky, the one intimate friend he had, and his political career was on a downward slide. His friends were so worried about his low mood that they feared he was suicidal, took all knives and razors from his room, and Joshua Speed went to his side and said, "Lincoln, if you don't rally, you will die." Lincoln said, "I would just as soon die now, but I haven't yet done anything to make any human being remember that I have lived." And then he espoused that dream that would carry him, saying that my goal in life is to accomplish something that makes life better for those that live around me, so that I can be remembered after I die. It carried him through his return to the state legislature, through his single term in Congress, when he lost popularity because he questioned the rationale of the Mexican-American War, arguing in terms that may echo us today, that the president had deceived the country by the way he went into the Mexican-American War, and that in fact he was considered, however, by arguing that, a Benedict Arnold, because the war was very popular and no one wanted to hear any complaints about the war, and he wasn't able to run for the congressional seat again. It carried him through 2 failed terms in the Senate. Then he still, despite all those failures, decided to enter the Republican race for the presidency in 1860. Someone else might have said, maybe you should go into another line of work. But he had this interior confidence that somehow he might have a chance. He was clearly the dark horse candidate. Everyone expected Seward, who'd been the governor and senator of New York, to win. If not Seward, they expected Chase, the governor and senator from Ohio. If not Chase, then the elder statesman of Missouri, Edward Bates. But somehow Lincoln was able, because he worked harder than the other ones did. He understood the mood of the convention better than the others. He had made no enemies along the way, as each of them had. And he had a strategy that told all the delegates, if you can't have your first love, come to me as your second love. And they did, stunning each one of his rivals. But then he stunned them even more by placing each one of them into his cabinet. It was an unprecedented act at the time. especially since each of them thought they should have been president instead of Lincoln. Far better educated, far better resumes, and far certain that they would be better than he. But he said these were the strongest men in the country. The country was in peril, and they needed to have these people in his cabinet. He knew that it would strengthen his own thinking by having to argue with them day by day, and boy, did they argue, calling each other names. Not only did they resent the fact that Lincoln had won, they hated one another. They all came from different aspects of the Republican Party. Some had been former Democrats, former Whigs, former nativists, former abolitionists. But he felt that if he had all these opposite viewpoints that he had to contend with within his official family, his own thinking would be helped as a result. But maybe Lyndon Johnson once again understood it better, where he said, it's better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. Now, of all of these rivals, Seward was the one, I think, that captured my emotion the most. He reminded me in many ways of Winston Churchill. Larger than life, huge appetites. Like Churchill, he could drink all day and then work the next morning. He loved his cigars. He loved his snuff. He had dinner parties during the 50s where he invited both Southerners and Northerners, gave them so much wine and so much good food that they ended up hugging one another at the end of the evening. And it seemed, however, an irrecoverable disappointment when he did not become president, since he was clearly the anti-slavery champion of the 1850s. And yet, eventually, even though at first he thought that Lincoln would be a figurehead and he would run Lincoln, he came to understand that Lincoln was unlike anyone he had ever known, gave up his own ambitions to be president in 1864, became not only Lincoln's partner, not only Lincoln's ally, but in many ways his greatest friend. Lincoln loved nothing more than to go to Seward's house at Lafayette Park at the end of the day. The two of them would talk way into the night about everything else other than the war. They loved going to plays together. In fact, Lincoln went 100 times to Shakespeare plays during the war, with Seward often as his companion, saying to himself that if he could somehow transport himself for a few hours into another time and another age, he could replenish his energies to face the struggles of the following day. Now, almost opposite in personality to Seward was Chase. He, unlike Seward, considered drinking and smoking evil. He thought novels were a waste of time, that theater was sinful. He had a relentless drive to be the President of the United States. It was so sad in many ways because he'd accomplished so much in his life. He had been considered the Attorney General of runaway slaves in Ohio in the 1840s and 50s, governor and senator from Ohio, a great Secretary of Treasury under Lincoln. But because he never reached his goal of becoming president, it was as if he felt his life was a failure. In many ways, I suspect that relentless drive came from a terrible void in his private life. He had lost 3 wives who were young. The first died at 22 in childbirth, the next at 25 of tuberculosis, the third in her early 30s of tuberculosis, and he never did marry again. Putting all of his love into his daughter, Kate, whom he sent to a boarding school in New York at the age of 7, where she stayed until 17, learning classics and literature and history in the hopes that she could become the First Lady of the land, in many ways his surrogate wife. She emerged one of the most beautiful and fascinating women of her age, his companion, his political manager. She had hugely wonderful parties in Washington during the Civil War, so much so they became a rival to the White House receptions, and Mary Lincoln hated her. But nonetheless, when it came time for her to marry, though hundreds of people would have wanted to marry her, she chose a very wealthy older man named Sprague, who was a multimillionaire, in part, I believe, so that he could foster her father's political ambitions. The marriage turned out to be a disaster. He was an alcoholic. He abused her. She ended up having a child who committed suicide, and she ended up dying in poverty. And Chase never did reach his goal to become President of the United States, but not for lack of trying. In 1864, even when Lincoln was still president, he tried to run against him, spreading bad news about Lincoln, using the Treasury Department to mobilize a political machine against Lincoln. Lincoln knew everything that Chase was doing, but he still kept him on so long as he was doing a good job in the Treasury. Finally, even amazingly, after Lincoln wins the nomination and wins the election in 1864, a vacancy arises in the Supreme Court in the post of Chief Justice, and he appoints Chase to this post, and his friends come to him and say, "How can you do that? Don't you know these things he's been saying about you all this time?" Lincoln said, "I know meaner things that Chase has said about me than any of you do." Lincoln always knew what was going on. He loved to gossip with journalists. He was always in touch with what was happening. He said, "In fact, on a personal level, I'd rather swallow a chair than appoint Chase to this post, but he'll be the best man for the rights of the emancipated slaves, and that's what matters." He appointed Chase Supreme Court Chief Justice, and he was right. He did protect the rights of the freed slaves. Now, Bates was almost just the opposite of Chase in terms of the arc of his life. He had started early on, very ambitious, early on in the Missouri State Convention that created the Constitution of the state legislator, but then he fell so deeply in love with his wife, Julia, that he couldn't bear being away from her very long. When he was going to Congress, one of the first times, he wrote her these wonderful letters saying, "Why am I doing this? I feel this restless, indefinable feeling away from you. This is nuts. Why don't I just come home to you?" He then turned down other chances to be in politics, turned down high cabinet posts that he was offered. He just wanted, he said, to be with his wife, Julia. Well, it turned out he wasn't away from her too long because they ended up having 17 children. So they managed to stay together some of these nights. Needless to say, when he was appointed Attorney General, however, he thought Lincoln was competent, but not much more than that. By the end of Lincoln's presidency, he thought Lincoln was as near a perfect man as anyone he had ever met. But maybe the most remarkable transformation in attitudes toward Lincoln took place with Stanton, who became his Secretary of War. They had met in 1855 when Stanton and he were both lawyers. Stanton, a nationally known lawyer in Ohio, Lincoln only known in Illinois. Stanton had a big patent case that was supposed to be tried in Illinois, so his partner thought they needed someone of counsel in Illinois. They came to interview Lincoln, put him on the case, and Lincoln was so excited at the thought of working with Stanton. He worked all summer on his brief, but then the case got transferred from Illinois back to Ohio, and they didn't need Lincoln anymore, but they forgot to tell him. So he worked all summer on the brief, went so excited to Cincinnati, goes up to Stanton in his typically affable way and said, "Let's go up to the courthouse together." It is said that when Stanton took one look at Lincoln with a big stain on his shirt, his disheveled hair, his trousers too short, he said to his partner, "We've got to get rid of this long-armed ape. He will hurt our cause and our case." They turned their back on him, never read the brief he had prepared. They didn't let him sit with them in the boarding house, humiliating him so much that he said he never wanted to go back to Cincinnati again. But amazingly, 6 years later, when his first Secretary of War, Cameron, had failed, everybody comes to him and says, "Stanton's the man for the job." He is somehow able to put that past hurt and that past grudge behind, so rare in political life, and decide, yes, if he's the right man for this job, I will forget the past. And the two of them become extraordinary partners, completely opposite in temperament. Stanton was passionate. He was tough on subordinates. He was very unable to hold his temper back. Lincoln, always patient, wanting to pardon every soldier who fell asleep on checkpoint duty. Stanton feeling that the discipline of the Army required that he put that person to death. And they argued incessantly. But in the end, Stanton ended up loving him more than anyone outside of his family. So what were the leadership qualities that allowed Lincoln to mobilize all of these people, formerly his rivals, into either respect, affection, or beating them at their own game? I think his most remarkable quality was an empathy that probably was part of his temperament from the time he was young. He seemed to have an ability to understand the way other people were feeling and thinking in a true way. I mean, even in the 1850s when he was an anti-slavery orator, and most of the Republicans who were arguing against slavery would talk about the Southerners as evil, unchristian men, he would argue they are what we would be in their situation. If they no longer had slavery, they would not introduce it. If we in the North still had it, we wouldn't know what to do with it. I will not judge them on not knowing what I myself would not know what to do. And then part of his ability was also to share credit for success. It's a wonderful story was told when Grant became commander of the Union armies, and they had a huge reception in the White House, and everybody was going over to talk to Grant, and Lincoln was left almost alone in the middle of this White House reception. And someone went up to him and said, "Well, how do you feel?" And what he was able to say and to understand was the path to success is wide enough for two people to walk it abreast, understanding that if Grant were able to succeed, that would only benefit him in the long run. Let him have his moment of glory. As well as he was able to share the credit for success, he shouldered responsibility for failure. When his first Secretary of War, Cameron, was about to be censured by the Congress for having let contracts in the early days of the war to middlemen who made off with scandalous profits for weapons that didn't work, for horses that were blind, for knapsacks that fell apart in the rain, Cameron felt like his whole life was coming to an end with his censure in Congress. Lincoln stood up and sent a letter to the Congress saying if anyone were to blame, it were he and his entire cabinet, that it was part of the chaos of the early days of the war, and they did the best they could, and that it was not Cameron's fault. Cameron later said no one else would have stood by him when things were so low. But as he said, and as Seward had said before him, Lincoln was unlike anyone he had ever known. He was always quick to acknowledge his own error and to learn from his mistakes. It was easy, he said, if he had to change his mind on something, he said, I'd like to believe I'm smarter today than I was yesterday. When I think about our politicians who feel so compelled to say, I'm really saying the same thing I said 30 years ago as journalists come after them, why not say, yes, I've changed my mind, I've learned more. He was able in a letter to Grant to say, you were right, I was wrong, I'm glad you were right. And then when he was angry, he had this wonderful ritual that he would write hot letters to the people he was angry with, his subordinates. All of his emotion would come out, and then he'd put them aside, hoping that he would cool down. A most famous example of this was after General Meade failed to follow up after Gettysburg with Lee's army. He wrote him a letter saying, I'm distressed immeasurably. Had you gone after Lee's army at this point, the war might have ended, but now it's going to go on indefinitely. But knowing how much it would hurt General Meade, he put it aside, was never found until decades later when his papers were opened with a notation on it, never sent, never signed. But that way his emotions got out without having to hurt the people around him. And then after each battle, he immediately went to the battlefront, knowing that it was important for him to buoy the morale of his troops. He went more than a dozen times to the active front during the war. No president had ever done that. Teddy Roosevelt once said, example is the most potent of all things. And Lincoln understood that. He knew if he walked amidst their ranks, if he went to the wounded in the hospital, told them that he still had faith in them, that he too would buoy his own spirits by seeing their faith in him, and he could come back then and communicate that faith to the American people. And never did he forget where he came from. He had a wonderfully open White House. I mean, it's so impossible to imagine today given our security concerns, but anybody who wanted a job could actually roam into the White House, knock on his door, and tell their life story to him and why they needed a particular job. These are the days before civil service. And his secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, would despair, saying, Lincoln, you don't have time to spend with these people. And he would say, these are my public opinion baths. I need to remember the popular assemblage from which I have come. The receptions at the White House were open to diplomats and backwoodsmen alike. He would shake every hand until his own hand would shake from the shaking. Indeed, the most extraordinary example of that is on January 1st, 1863, when he was set to sign the Emancipation Proclamation that afternoon. But he had shaken so many hands that morning that his own hand was numb and it was shaking. So as he was about to sign the proclamation, he put the pen down and said, wait, I've got to wait. My whole soul is in this act. I am not hesitating in the slightest. But if my hands should shake, posterity will think I hesitated. So he waited until he could sign with a bold, clear hand. And always he understood that the key to a war in a democracy was to keep public sentiment on the side of the war. So he would time his public lectures, he would time his speeches so that he could keep sustaining the morale of the American people, especially the North during that time when so many losses were being felt. And of course, the beauty of the Gettysburg Address, when he offered something even larger than union, something larger than emancipation, what he argued the soldiers were fighting for was nothing less than the dream of a democracy where ordinary people could govern themselves. He always believed that if the South should achieve its desire to secede from the Union, then perhaps someday the West would secede from the East, and the whole thing would implode, and the monarchs all around the world would be happy that this experiment had somehow failed. But somehow at the Gettysburg Address, he was able to give the meaning to all those who had died, that they were indeed fighting for something as noble as the idea that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth. So in the end, I came to understand that the qualities that he possessed, an extraordinary array really of emotional qualities, are ones we don't always associate with political life: compassion, sensitivity, empathy, honesty, straightforwardness. And yet, when you think about it, since politics is all about human relationships, those qualities are the ones that will give you the greatest stead in the long run. So you can imagine living with such a man like this. It was so hard to bring his story to a close, especially hard to deal with the last chapters, knowing that he had only a few days, really, to absorb the fact that the North would win the war, that this dream of preserving the Founding Fathers' democracy might indeed be realized. And yet I knew that he didn't know that he was going to die within days of that understanding. On that last afternoon of his life, he invited his wife Mary for a carriage ride. telling her that they had to somehow try to be happier than they had been during the sad days of the war. Theirs had been a turbulent marriage. In many ways, I think, however, when they first got married, she was very well suited to him. She loved politics. She loved poetry. She could share with him his ambition to do something important in life. And yet once they got to the White House, somehow there was no time for him to spend with her. She had no footing that she could stand on. The Southerners distrusted her because she was married to him. The Northerners distrusted her because she came from Kentucky and had 4 stepbrothers who were in the Confederate Army. And then when their son Willie died in February of 1862, she never did recover. 4 children in the family. A younger son had died at 3 years old much earlier. Her oldest son was at Harvard, Robert, and then 2 little boys, Willie and Tad, were 10 and 8. When Willie died, she took to her bed, and she became depressed, and I think never for the rest of her life recovered. So much so that Lincoln then had to become both mother and father to that youngest child, Tad. But on that last afternoon, he said to her, "Mary, we've been so sad for so long between the war and Willie's death. We must try to look forward to life again." And they began to imagine what might have been possible for them when the presidency was over, the trips they might have taken. She wanted to go to Europe. He wanted to go over the Rockies to California. They both wanted to go to the Holy Land, making the events of that evening even sadder to contemplate. I had not fully absorbed, I think, the full extent of the conspiracy that John Wilkes Booth had hatched for that very night. For not only was he planning to kill Abraham Lincoln, but his 2 co-conspirators had 2 targets in mind. The second one was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson. Luckily for the vice president, when he got to the hotel where Johnson was staying, where he was supposed to go to his room, knock on the door, and then kill him, he went to the bar first, got drunk, and never did carry out his mission. So Andrew Johnson was never a target. But the third conspirator was to go and kill Mr. Seward, and he almost achieved his aim. Seward's house, as always, was filled with a dozen people, but somehow, unaccountably, the assassin got to the bottom of the stairs, pretending he had medicine for Seward, who had been in a carriage accident several weeks before, whose jaw had been broken, and he was up in bed with a wired jaw. He got to the top of the stairs with this medicine, encountered Seward's son, said he had the medicine. Seward's son said, "I will take it into him. He's sleeping." Took the revolver with the blunt edge, hit Seward's son with it such force that his brain was exposed and he was in a coma for days, ran into the room with a huge knife, slashed Seward's other son, slashed the soldier nurse who was taking care of Seward, went to Seward's bedside, slashed his own face with such fervor that Seward's entire cheek was torn off. But somehow the very fact that his jaw was wired prevented that jugular vein from being reached, and Seward, after months, was able to recover. But of course, as we all know, John Wilkes Booth did accomplish his goal, coming in the back of the Ford's Theater as an actor, having complete control of wherever he could go in that theater, putting the bullet in the back of Lincoln's neck. The doctors said that he should have died instantly. The wound was that devastating, but somehow his will to live was so strong that he lasted until 7:22 a.m. the following morning, when Stanton uttered the words that have come down through the generations, "Now he belongs to the ages." So as time went by, however, his reputation only continued to grow and to grow. I was so happy to find a Tolstoy story that allowed me to end the book not on the sad moment of his assassination, but with the following story. In 1908, Tolstoy was interviewed by the New York World, and he told this amazing story of having gone to a remote area of the Caucasus some years prior to that, where he encountered a whole bunch of wild barbarians who had never left this area of Russia. And they were so excited that Tolstoy was there, they asked him to tell great stories of the men of the West. So Tolstoy said, "I told them all about Napoleon and Frederick the Great and Alexander, and they were loving every moment of it. But before I finished, they stopped him and they said, 'But wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all. We want to hear about that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, that man who comes from that place called America, which is so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he would be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln.'" Tolstoy was stunned that they had heard of Lincoln, and he told them everything he knew about his difficult upbringing, his move through politics, and the Emancipation Proclamation. And then he asked himself, so what was it about Lincoln that made him greater than these other rulers? Not a great statesman like Frederick the Great, not a great general like Napoleon, but he said his greatness consisted in the character of his being and the moral fiber of his being. And I think for generations, historians would agree with that understanding. So that dream that had powered Lincoln for all those years through his bleak childhood, those laborious efforts to educate himself, that string of political failures, the dream that gave him an indomitable sense of purpose during the darkest days of the war, allowing him to rally his disheartened countrymen to soothe the animosity of his colleagues, somehow had been realized. His story would be told after he died. Which brings me back at the end to where my love of history really began, with my own family, to the days when my father taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games when I was only 6 years old. And somehow when he came home every night and I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game, he made me feel it was somehow magical to be able to tell him that story at night. And I began to think that history itself was magical to keep my father's attention. In fact, I'm convinced that I learned the narrative art from those nightly sessions with my father, because at first I'd be so excited I would blurt out, "The Dodgers won," or "The Dodgers lost," which took much of the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. Much later, read an essay by my heroine, Barbara Tuchman, who said even if you're writing about a war, you have to imagine to yourself you do not know how that war ended, so you can carry your reader with you every step along the way, from beginning to middle to end. So in some ways, I just learned that instinctively as a child, trying to keep my father's attention. And though my father died before my 3 sons were born, I have passed his memory as well as his love of baseball to each of my boys, though my team now, after the Dodgers left me and went to Los Angeles, has now become my irrational love for the Boston Red Sox. When we sit at Fenway Park with our season tickets, I can sometimes close my eyes and imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below, Roy Campanella, Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider. I must say there is magic in these moments, for when I open my eyes and I see my sons in the place where my father once sat, I feel an almost invisible loyalty and love, linking my sons to the grandfather whose face they never had a chance to see, but whose heart and soul they have come to know through all the stories I have told. Which is why in the end I shall always be grateful for this love of history which has led me through a lifetime to study the past, allowing me to believe that the private people we have loved and lost in our families and the public figures we have respected in our history, as Abraham Lincoln wanted to believe, really can live on, so long as we pledge to tell and to retell the stories of their lives. Thank you for letting me do that with you tonight. Thank you.
Doris, thank you. Thank you for honoring us with your presence, and thank you for continuing to write. I wanted to ask you a couple of personal questions, if we might. As Lincoln, as our war president, what your feelings were as your own son, Joey, while you were working on this book, your own son was over in Iraq in a war. That must have been very poignant for you.
Yes, for those of you who don't know, what our youngest son, Joey, graduated from Harvard College in History and Literature in June of '01 with no thought about going into the Army. But then after September 11th, he decided to join the Army. And he went to basic training and officers candidate school, and then was sent over as a platoon leader in Baghdad for a year in a slum sector of a bad section of Baghdad. And during that time he was over there, it was when I was working on this book and trying to figure out what to write him at night. And I'd be reading, of course, about Lincoln pardoning soldiers who fell asleep on checkpoint duty. So writing him and saying, "Don't fall asleep on checkpoint duty. And if you do, Lincoln's around." It was really interesting because here was a war, in terms of the Civil War that I felt had to be fought. Whatever questions I had about the war in Iraq, I wanted it to go well. And my son came away from that experience. In many ways, it was almost a metaphor for the war itself, because he got there right after a mission had presumably been accomplished. He had a peaceful reconstruction mission. He was so excited. He was going into the Iraqis' homes for dinner, had a translator. And then And then within days, of course, when the security broke down, there were no more Iraqi dinners, no more translators. Instead, he had 3 major assignments: checkpoint duty, weapon searches, and eventually taking his platoon out as a target, hoping the insurgents would shoot at them so they could shoot at the insurgents in turn. And yet, despite that change in the whole mission of what he had hoped he would accomplish, he came away feeling that it had been the most extraordinary experience. I mean, here's a kid who grew up in affluent Concord, Mass., went to Harvard College, saw a world he never would have seen before, and had an extraordinary experience with his platoon. I'm proud to say he won a Bronze Star for bravery when he was over there. And then when he came back, got the chance to throw out a first ball at Fenway Park, when he said he was more nervous that week than he was in his entire time. And this is when we learned that RPGs had been flying over his head. He never told us any of this. He said, more nervous now than when an RPG went over my head. But I must say, I wish more young people had had that chance to contribute to the country after September 11th. I keep thinking about what happened in World War II when Roosevelt was able to mobilize all of us to care about that world. I mean, I'm a kid at that time, but all of the American people at that time, by having Red Cross drives, by having victory gardens, by having rationing, by calling for people working in the factories, auxiliary fire and police, and of course a draft that meant everybody knew somebody who was fighting overseas. And I sometimes used to feel when I was reading the newspapers and see those black letters of the people who were dying in Iraq, how lonely it must have been for the parents, because without a draft, and especially in this environment in which we were living up here, there weren't all that many people who knew that many people who were over in Iraq. And I somehow feel it would have been a better chance for us to understand that war if more congressmen and senators' children had been over there, much as our own child was. So it was an extraordinary experience to think about war, to think about leadership while having a child there. But thank God he's home safe. He just got home a couple months ago, so it's a good thing.
He's back.
Thank you.
It is striking. I think there was only one child of one member of Congress in military uniform at the time.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing. It just means that sense of following a war every day with the emotions that should be there when people are in harm's way is not there when you have this kind of a volunteer army.
Now, how is it? I can't remember in the past when you've written a book and it's so close to becoming a film. Tell us about that.
Well, what happened is that...
this book.
Yeah, Steven Spielberg evidently had long wanted to make a film about Abraham Lincoln. So I met him way back in 2000, and he asked me then, I was working with him, or just helping a bunch of historians, giving him advice on a documentary that he was doing for the Millennium at the Lincoln Memorial. When he found out I was doing this, he asked me to shake hands and said that when it was finished, he would have the first look at it. Like, how many other people are going to want to make a movie about Lincoln? I was thrilled. But then he would call me from the various movie sets he was on, and I would tell him whatever had happened to Lincoln that day. And he finally decided he didn't want to wait until the book was done. So he optioned and then bought out the right for the book years ago, set a couple script writers to it, so he's got some scripts in hand, and he's chosen Liam Neeson to play Abraham Lincoln. And Neeson has really done a wonderful job already of going around to see Kentucky and Illinois and various Lincoln sites. And hopefully the movie will start getting made sometime in 2007, and I think will be out in about 2008. So one of the nicest things that's happened, though, is that the Lincoln historians were incredibly welcoming to me when I started this project 10 years ago as a rookie. Many of them have spent their lives on Lincoln. And instead of feeling like, well, here's this new person who doesn't know anything, which it was true, I knew so little, they welcomed me and they gave me their libraries, they exchanged books with me, they exchanged ideas. And now the wonderful thing is he's asked me to pull together a group of historians to meet with him. And it's so nice to be able to have them now be part of this think tank for Lincoln, and for them to be teasing that now their children are so excited that they're meeting with Steven Spielberg.
Well, it may be one of the few ennobling things that happens during the 2008 campaign. We'll have to wait and see. Your husband, Richard, has a magic with words, too. His memoirs of his days in the public arena are just one of the best books of Washington from his time. And he was also very instrumental. But the Great Society is something that, among many other contributions, that phrase, I think, came out of his work for President Johnson at that time. The two of you must have talked a great deal as you worked on this about Lincoln's power with words.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, my husband, You know, in fact, I think in many ways I fell in love with my husband when I was a graduate student here at Harvard and listened, not knowing then I would ever meet him, to a speech that Lyndon Johnson gave called the We Shall Overcome speech. Yeah. This is the speech at the time of the Selma demonstrations when Johnson decided to go to a joint session of Congress in order to call for a Voting Rights Act for Black Americans. And it's a wonderful story that Dick tells because he was at a dinner party at Arthur Schlesinger's house that Sunday night before this joint session. They heard Johnson was going to give this speech to the joint session of Congress. He goes home, looks at his phone, and it doesn't call for him to go. So he said, I'm not writing the speech. Evidently, Jack Valenti had been in there the night before and had assigned the speech to Horace Busby, who was a public relations man from Texas who worked on the White House staff. And he gets in the next morning, and Lyndon Johnson says to him, how's Dick Goodwin coming on that speech? And he said, well, I assigned it to Horace Busby. And Johnson said, what? You assigned it to a Texas public relations guy? Don't you know that a liberal Jew from New England has his heart on the pulse beat of America? You get Goodwin to work on that speech. So anyway, Dick had only that day to work on that speech, which is in some ways, I think, probably what helped it. As you know so well, there's so many speechwriters now around that they all can screw up everybody else's speech. And the only time Johnson interrupted him at all was to say he wanted to say something about his teaching Mexican Americans in Cotula. And that speech was an incredible speech. It's where Johnson said, you know, every now and then history and fate come together at a single place at a single time. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was at Selma, Alabama. This is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, an American problem. And then, in the middle of it, he said, and paused, we shall overcome, which meant he took that anthem of the civil rights movement. I'd been active like so many other people. We used that movement and that words sort of against Lyndon Johnson, and now he was absorbing it, which meant he was one of us. And I listened to that speech here at Harvard, and then later when I met him, I think that was the beginning of the romance. But it's something he should always be proud of. But anyway, to answer your question, it was terrific to have him to work on this book with. I mean, he really read every page. He talked to me about everything. He's always had this huge feeling of respect and affection for Lincoln and understood the importance of words to Lincoln and the rhythms that had gotten into Lincoln's heads from Shakespeare and poetry that made him our best poet president.
Yeah, he called him the best poet president.
Yeah.
It was so interesting. Andrew DeValco wrote a book on America's best writers, and he has a chapter on Lincoln.
Oh, he could have been. Had he not been president, he would have, I think, would have been a great writer by himself. I mean, he wrote so clearly. He had such an extraordinary use. A friend of mine now, Doug Wilson, is writing a book called Lincoln's Sword, which is about his editing skills. You know, just showing, we always think he did these things on the spur. That's never true. I mean, he certainly did not write the Gettysburg Address on an envelope, which was part of the mythology that developed. He would write whenever a thought came to him and put it in a desk, little fragments, and then or in his hat, in that ridiculous stovepipe hat, he'd put little thoughts, and then he'd empty the hat, and then he'd work on it and on it and on it. He understood that something becomes good only with work and editing over and over again.
And what did the words mean? How did they affect his leadership? You read about him giving significance to things, giving meaning.
I mean, I think what he understood was somehow that if you're going to have, as it turned out, 600,000 people die in this war, which would be equivalent to 5 million people dying today, that if you're going to keep the North on your side at a time when some people were beginning to say that his Emancipation Proclamation had frozen the South to deciding that they couldn't stop the war because they'd have to keep going to keep slavery, that he was the cause of it, so they're peeling away from the Northern Coalition at a time when everyone else is wondering, will there ever be an end to this war? He had to keep sustaining them with the thought that however horrible this is, however many lives are being lost, what we are fighting for is so deep that you will be feeling ennobled by being part of this enormous struggle. And he did give that feeling of meaning, not only to the soldiers, but I think to the Northern people that allowed them to sustain their morale through those darkest days of the war.
Yeah, David Herbert Donald once wrote, I think, that if Lincoln had been president of the Confederacy and they'd switched presidents, Jefferson Davis been president of the Union, the war might have had a different outcome. Do you go that far?
I think Donald was right in a sense. I mean, I think what that meant was that the Southerners had the generals, certainly early on, while Lincoln was still screwing around with McClellan, who I ended up hating, I must say. Oh, my God. The one thing that McClellan did was to write endless letters to his wife, which are so terrible, and then they got published, which have hurt his legacy enormously, calling Stanton a traitor. At one point, when McClellan lost, I was thinking about this because obviously everybody's talking today about these generals who have now come out against Rumsfeld. And at a certain point, McClellan was so upset with Stanton, the Secretary of War, because he had lost the Peninsula Campaign for his own mistakes, in my judgment. But he thought it was because Stanton had refused to give him the number of troops he needed. So he writes a letter to his wife saying that if Stanton had lived in the time of Judas, Judas would be a hero because Stanton was so terrible. I mean, you can imagine that's the kind of language that allowed him to not go down too well in history. But finally, there was such a drumbeat against Stanton in the newspapers, spurred by McClellan, that Lincoln again had to go to a huge Union meeting in the Capitol and say, I'm not letting Stanton take the burden of this fault. I did not have the troops to send to him. There were no troops to send to him. And that finally ended the criticism because all the newspapers were calling for Stanton to resign. And it looked like he was not going to keep his job, but Lincoln was able to support him at that moment. But all those times are when he just understood when to speak up, didn't speak too often. I think what happens to our current presidents is because they speak so frequently, even though President Bush has stood up now for Rumsfeld this last week, we've heard him say it before. We're used to him speaking up. Whereas when Lincoln chose to speak, it was a very unusual thing to do. Just like when Roosevelt gave his fireside chats during World War II, he was only on the radio 3 times a year, and everybody would listen as a result. It was said you could walk down the street on a hot night and you could just hear everybody's radio going, and you wouldn't have to stop walking. You could hear the fireside chat. Well, now our president's on the radio every weekend. So there's nothing special about those moments. And I think that's part of the difficulty today compared to Lincoln's time.
Less is more.
Less is more, exactly so.
Yeah. It's striking, coming, especially being an institution like this, which stresses the importance of analytical skills. When you write about Lincoln, indeed how you write about Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, it was their emotional intelligence, as we now use that phrase, that seemed to serve them so well as leaders.
Now, I really do think prior to whatever analytical skills one would have in figuring out policy, there has to be who it is that you're dealing with, whether it's your official family, whether it's the bureaucracy, whether it's the Congress and the senators. I mean, those are people that have to carry out and implement whatever analysis you've come up to as to which policy you want to implement at a particular time. And that's where these emotional skills of understanding other human beings and how to deal with them without losing them, how to not make enemies if you can, are really primary. I almost think that that's the foundation. And then obviously when you have people that are going, it's what Newstead wrote about in Presidential Power. I mean, he was my mentor when I was here. I loved that man. And he understood that really what a president had to do was to understand how to bargain with all the various constituencies that he had to deal with. And it is more of an emotional set of qualities, I believe, than an analytical set of qualities.
Is there a way you think that can be learned or taught?
I do think so. I mean, I think part of it is temperament, but I think part of it also is that if you learn from experience that somehow, suppose, for example, somebody does hurt you, and yet you're able to say, in the short term, I want to get back at them, but I know from experience that if I can mobilize them to come on my side, they can help me in the long run. Then you can do it time and time again, if you know that. I mean, I think these, it's interesting. Presidents learned from one another. I mean, it was interesting when I read later that when Harry Truman was trying to decide what to do about MacArthur, he went and sent somebody to the Library of Congress to figure out how had Lincoln finally gotten rid of McClellan. And when Teddy Roosevelt was trying to decide what to do in the coal strike, when he had to mediate, because he had a certain empathy at that time, understanding what labor wanted and what capital wanted, and he mediated between them, but he went back and read Nicolay and Hay to understand Lincoln's empathy. So I think I think some of it, if you don't have it internally within you, you can't develop. But I think just as people develop better relationships with people over time, I think you can learn it, and I think it can be taught, and I think it would be very wise if schools of government could think in those terms as well as the analytical terms where mathematics and economics and all that comes into play. But without this learned understanding about human relationships, you're not going to get anywhere. And we have had a lot of presidents in recent times that have not gotten too far.
Interesting. It was also interesting in the way you described Lincoln, that he understood himself very well. He came to understand his own moods, and that he had the message I took away from your book was, in part, that Lincoln wasn't able to totally conquer his various emotional issues, but he was able to manage them. He learned how to manage them.
You're absolutely right. He knew, I think from the time he was young, there was a sadness. And I think when he was younger, the sadness was exacerbated because he had this hope of doing something important, and he looked at the reality of his circumstances, and he thought he was never going to be able to realize that hope. And the poetry that he liked when he was young, for example, there was one that had to do with a poor young villager who had untapped talent but died in an unmarked grave. And that haunted him, the idea that you could have talent, but it would never be realized. So I think once he got to the presidency, some of his moods were able to be flattened to some degree because he certainly had reached a point where he knew his talents were being utilized to the fullest dimension. But on the other hand, he would just sometimes wake up sad because he did not have an optimistic temperament. In contrast to Franklin Roosevelt, who was just born with a temperament that assumed that he was happy, and he almost contagiously was able to make other people feel that way. Lincoln was born with a different kind of temperament. But knowing that, it meant that when he saw that sadness beginning to envelop him, he would go over to Seward's house to talk to him. He would go visit the troops if he needed to. He would go to a Shakespeare play. He would read a funny story to his cabinet. He would go and read poetry, or he'd go visit Nicolay and Hay. It was almost as if he were his own best psychiatrist. He knew what to do to mobilize himself out of his sadnesses. And in a certain sense, that's an even deeper capacity than Roosevelt's ability to be optimistic much of the time, because he's able to both create that sense of hope with the people he's around it, but he's able to mobilize the sadness as well to a positive goal.
Yeah. We're going to go to the floor here in just a moment, so if you wish to ask a question, there are microphones on either side, and there are 2 microphones up here, but I want to ask you about one last, I'd love to talk to you for hours, but his leadership in moving from, in effect, changing course. McPherson would argue he changed course during the war from a limited war strategy to a total war strategy, but he really moved the country with the Emancipation Proclamation, moving from a time when he did not contemplate that to actually doing it, which has to be one of the greatest acts of presidential leadership that we know, and he pulled it off. Oh. And he brought the country with him. That's what it's.
No,
I've always tried to understand, how did he do that?
I think what he understood, which is what Roosevelt understood in those years before World War II, when he was mobilizing the country step by step to understanding the importance of the Allied cause at a time when we had an isolationist country in front of us, he knew that he couldn't move too quickly. He had to create, through his speeches and his actions, educate the country and shape and mold public opinion. So that's exactly what Lincoln did, step by step, up to emancipation. At the first, he didn't think he had the power to emancipate the slaves until he began to understand that the slaves were an enormous resource helping the South, and that they sort of balanced the war on the side of the Confederacy because they were being used in the trenches, they were protecting the plantations back at home, they were being used to cook for the soldiers. They were really a resource that the North needed on their side. And then once he understood that, then he finally came to, this was an analytic understanding. This was where he had to think it through. If that's so, then even though I don't have the constitutional power to end slavery in the states where it already exists, with my commander-in-chief powers, I can say that I'm going to emancipate these slaves because my war powers will allow me to do it, because they are a resource for the South, and I have a right to undo that resource. So that was his analytical thinking, but then he had to prepare the country step by step for that. So he started it out in little ways by, first of all, when the slaves had run away into the Union lines, allowing them to stay there instead of sending them back, which some people thought they should, and then allowing them to stay in and actually work on the Union lines, and then eventually to argue that emancipation was going to happen, and then eventually, slowly, saying that the slaves who then had become freed could actually serve in the armed forces, which many people didn't think were possible at the time, so that gradually the country became educated to something that at the first, as McPherson argued, that at the beginning there was a fear that if you allowed all these steps to take place, the Northern soldiers who thought they were fighting only for the Union would leave. They'd go home. This isn't what they were thinking they were fighting the war for. But gradually they absorbed that there was a larger purpose than the Union, and that was to emancipate the slaves and give America a new birth of freedom, as he said at Gettysburg. And then he brings it all together at Gettysburg. And then, amazingly, I mean, I still think the most extraordinary thing is that second inaugural, when here's the North on the eve of winning that war, when you might have expected a triumphal speech, and instead he argues that the sin of slavery was shared by both sides, that both sides read the same Bible, both prayed to the same God, neither's prayers had been answered. And then, of course, the words we all know when he called for the idea that there should be charity for all. I mean, it's an extraordinary moment when a leader knows he wants to bring both sides back together again in some sort of peaceful reconciliation. He's great, I must say. Yeah. I mean, it's so embarrassing. I liked him at the beginning and I respected him, but I had no understanding of the degree of affection I would feel for this man. I can't imagine feeling it for another president again. I mean, he is that big.
Wow. Dick Light, who's here on this faculty, has taken a survey of Harvard seniors.
He taught me statistics when I was young.
Well, he's taken a survey of Harvard seniors asking them the greatest speech ever given. I thought it would be How I Have a Dream. Second inaugural.
Is that right? Yeah. Well, good for the Harvard undergraduates.
Yeah, they want to, right? Over here. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Graves Tompkins. I'm a joint degree student here and at the business school. Thanks for coming, sharing with us tonight.
I'm glad to be here.
This question gets back to some of your earlier comments. Several weeks ago, David Brooks wrote a piece in the Times arguing that today, in particular, in a time of war and division and a weary public, the country desperately needs Lincoln's brand of leadership. How do you view this assessment, and where might we expect to find this kind of leadership?
Oh, I mean, that's a wonderful question. I think one that we all probably feel wistful about when you think about Lincoln. I mean, I think what Brooks was thinking of, and I would agree with him, is that at a time when we have such animus on the side of the red and blue states, and people feeling like the people on the opposite side of the spectrum are not just people with different points of view, but really hateful in a certain sense, that what he was hoping for was the kind of leader who could somehow bridge those gaps today and bring people to work together in some unified way towards some of the problems that are shared by all the different sides in the country. And I think the complication, I mean, people have said to me, do you think that Lincoln could win if he were to be running today? And I do think that there's no problem, as some people might think, with the fact that he might look funny. And first of all, he'd probably cut the beard off today. And people say, well, how would he be on television? He'd be great on television. I mean, I can imagine him with Jon Stewart or David Letterman. He could beat either one of them to their own game, and he'd be fantastic. The question would be, would Lincoln want to run for public office today? I mean, I think the hardest thing today is, have we made the pursuit of power, given what people have to go through to become political leaders today, with the animus that's there in the public campaigns, with the exposure of the private life, with your family having to be dragged into it, with the raising of campaign funds, are the best people willing still to enter public life? I have a feeling that probably his ambition was strong enough that would overleap all those things, and he still might be able to do it. But it would be much harder today, for example, to have somebody like him bring all of his rivals into a cabinet like this. Because can you imagine what they were saying against each other? He's a traitor. I mean, Blair, who was his postmaster general, would never set foot in the War Department because he hated Stanton so much. Chase hated Seward so much, and they were talking about each other in the worst terms. The newspapers would ferret that out today, and there would be so much fun for them, but making it impossible, I think, for this kind of a almost dysfunctional family to exist, doing great good for the country, but because it wasn't all known what they were feeling about each other. So I think it's much harder in today's world, but I guess I never lose my hope that our country seems somehow able at critical moments to have produced the leaders that were necessary, and nobody thought that Lincoln could have been that. Nobody thought Roosevelt was that at the time, thinking he was a lightweight playboy, as Lippmann said, and yet he performed. And I think it's possible that such a leader will arise again. I've got to. I mean, the kind of person who, like me, believed that the Red Sox would win the World Series has got to be an optimistic temperament.
Please identify yourself.
Kathleen Corbett. I'm a guest at the school today. I was wondering how, after living with Lincoln for all these years, what do you think he would think of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington?
What would he think of what?
What he would think of the Lincoln Memorial.
Oh, what would he think of the Lincoln Memorial? I think that he would love the Lincoln Memorial. It's the most beautiful statue, I think, that I've ever seen. In fact, The man who designed that statue, Daniel Chester French, comes from my hometown of Concord. And in fact, yesterday was Patriots' Day, and we were all out there for the reenactment of the battle, where these old Minutemen and old Redcoats guys who are quite old and fat, their uniforms not quite fitting on them anymore, go through the battle. But there is the Minuteman statue, that gorgeous statue that Daniel Chester French also did on the North Bridge, on the very street we live on. And I mean, there's something about that memorial and the dignity of that statue, and most importantly, the words that surround it, from the second inaugural, from the Gettysburg Address, that I think he would know that it was a place of reflection. And for a man who lived in his mind, I think he'd be so proud to know that that statue was there.
Thank you.
It's a great question.
Please.
Hi, my name is Evan Johnson. I'm a senior at the college. I was just wondering, at what point in the war years did Seward and Stanton and the other guys who sort of had this great hatred for Lincoln at the beginning really came to express this deep sort of affection that you detail so well?
It took each of them, I think, a different time. I mean, I think what happened, interestingly, Seward was the first, I think, to understand the greatness of Lincoln, because he started the furthest back in a way. When he first came into the cabinet post, he was certain that somehow he would be the prime minister and Lincoln would be a figurehead, as in England. And he writes this extraordinary memo on April 1st, 1861, saying that the country is drifting and there's no real policy, and they need somebody to lead, and if Lincoln wants him, he'll be the leader. And somehow Lincoln, rather again than saying, this is insubordinate, I'm going to fire you, he talks to him evidently in a gentle way, but says clearly, if anyone needs to make policy, I will make it. And Seward, not long after that, wrote to his wife and said, Lincoln is the best of us. He has executive will and energy. So I think he saw earlier, because they spent more time together, he was the first one to see it. Chase never did come to fully respect him. He couldn't, because he had so much ambition on his own and felt jealousy. I mean, jealousy was such a strong emotion with Chase that I think it's a terrible emotion, I think, in anybody, and it consumed Chase. Bates, I think, within maybe a year or two, saw that there was something special going on. Stanton, interestingly, started out, even when he was in Washington before he was made Secretary of War, and he had been in Buchanan's cabinet, and at that time he was writing terrible things about Lincoln, saying that Lincoln was a failure and that he didn't know what he was doing, and he was probably trying to, in a certain sense, suck up to Buchanan, making Buchanan feel better that the guy who followed him wasn't very good. So it took him a little bit longer, I think, and they did fight, as I said. But I would say probably by the end of 1862, Stanton had taken the measure of Lincoln, and he too came to understand and love him, as I said, more than anyone outside of his family. It was said that sometimes they would be waiting in the telegraph office for the news from the battlefront, and they would actually hold hands, so emotional. You can imagine what it's like, waiting to hear, have we lost another 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 men? And the two of them forged an extraordinary bond at that point. So it took different times. But by the end, really by 1863 and 4, they had come to understand that man.
Please.
Hi, my name is Ben Bolger, and I'm a grad student at Harvard. Had the tragedy of Lincoln's assassination not occurred, how do you think Lincoln would have used his leadership skills to help mend the relationship between the North and the South? Can you speculate on what he would have specifically done to help bring a more perfect union to realization?
Oh, I mean, that's the great question of history. I mean, if Lincoln had lived, would Reconstruction have been different? I think it would have still been, as he himself understood, he said it was the most troubling question ever presented to statesmanship. He knew the challenge that was there. And as difficult as it was for him to keep the coalition in the North together during the war, it would have been even more difficult to keep it together after the war, because even then the radicals wanted to punish the South. They wanted anybody who had even been at the level of a teacher or a lawyer to never be able to hold political office or vote again. And they wanted to sort of clear out, in many ways, the whole governing structure of the South. And many wanted economically even to start over again in the South. And then he had moderates like himself who was hoping to make sure that the rights of black Americans would be protected, but that you could bring back as many people from the South into the governing structure so that they'd feel part of the Union. And then on the side of the conservatives, you wanted them, in so many ways, some of them hoping, let's just go back to the old South and keep it as it once was, fearful of what would happen if black people were given too much power. So the chance to have brought all those people and kept them together would have been almost monumentally difficult. The only thing one hopes is that the skill that Lincoln had learned and begun to develop during the war of keeping that coalition together during the war, and then adding to that, he would have had the authority and the legitimacy of having been the guy who won the war, that he certainly would have had a better chance of doing it than Andrew Johnson did, who had none of the skills, none of the leadership qualities, none of the emotional traits. But I think Lincoln would have been the first to understand that perhaps his legacy would have been lessened because it would have been very messy. But a lessened Lincoln legacy would have been so much better for the country as a whole that I think all of us would have wished that he had lived a little bit longer.
So we might not have had the Jim Crow period.
I think it's possible. I mean, I think who knows? I mean, because it was so complicated. But I think it's very possible that if he had been there, he would have had another 3.5 years to keep his eye on what was going on. And he knew that what he was looking for was to keep the rights of the blacks to begin to be integrated into the society. I mean, his last speech that he gave before he was killed called for the beginning of voting rights for black Americans. And that was the speech that John Wilkes Booth heard and turned to his friend and said, he means Negro citizenship. I've got to kill him. So it would have been a very complicated process, but one has to hope. In fact, it's interesting. Sometimes people have said to me, what if you could only see Lincoln for an hour or two, what would you want to ask him? And that's the question that, of course, I'd most want to ask him, but I have a feeling that I would be superficial enough that instead, if I had my hour, I'd say, tell me some stories, Mr. Lincoln. So I could watch him laughing, and I could watch that face that they say when he told his stories, that sad face would suddenly get transformed, and his eyes would sparkle, and he would laugh harder than anyone else and clap his knee. And I think if I had an hour, I'd just listen to a bunch of his Ethan Allen type stories.
You like telling them.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Please.
Hi, my name is Ben Salco. I'm a junior at the college. You suggested how Lincoln was very conscious of his story and he very much wanted to be remembered favorably by history. And I guess that's a quality that's shared by many leaders, and particularly American presidents are very conscious of their legacies. As a historian, do you think history is generally fair to its leaders? Do you think it's too harsh or too kind? Are there any particular instances that you think history has been unjust to someone?
Oh, it's a really wonderful thought to contemplate. I think what happens is that leaders, when they first leave office, oftentimes encounter unfair analyses of their presidencies. I mean, for example, when Eisenhower first left office, I mean, David will know this probably better than I, having studied so many presidents as he has, but there was a general impression that was abroad in the land that he hadn't been very much in control of his administration, that he wasn't that smart, and that he wasn't that articulate. And then as time went by and memoirs came out and people wrote about his administration, it was clear that he was much shrewder than we knew he was, and his presidency became a more positive understanding than we had given it at the time. Similarly, when Lyndon Johnson died, and I know from those last months that I spent with him, he was so worried that historians would not give him a fair shake, because, as he said, they're those Harvard historians. They're never going to understand me in Texas. And in fact, in the early days, there's no question that the war in Vietnam did cut his hopes for being remembered well in two. But now when you read the historians' books that are coming out about him more and more, you see the historians' polls as opposed to the popular polls. His rank is going up and up as time goes by, in part because people are beginning to see in the time that's spent between the 60s and now what extraordinary accomplishments he made domestically. When you think about not only the Voting Rights Act, but the ending segregation in the South, open housing, Medicare, aid to education. And so people, I think, if a president has been able to advance economic or social justice, if a war has been importantly won, as obviously World War II was, or the Civil War, historians, I think, they go through periods where they may go down and up on a president. Even Lincoln, during a period of time when people were writing about him in the period right after World War I, when there was a general revulsion against war. There was a group of historians, and some of them Southern historians, but they argued maybe the war didn't have to be fought, and maybe he had provoked the war, and maybe all those lives were not necessary because slavery would have ended over time anyway, gradually. And his reputation went down for a period of time. And then when the civil rights movement came and the importance of the emancipation and the importance of black rights became much larger in consciousness, then that filtered its way into the historians and his reputation went up again. Then in the black community for a while, when it was known what he had said about black inequality when he was debating Stephen Douglas in the 50s, his reputation went down, and then now it seems to be understood more in the context of the time and coming back up. So I think presidents do suffer cyclical reputations, in part because new generations of historians want to make their own mark. So they either make him go up or go down in terms of making their new mark, but the great ones live on. So.
Great, please.
I'm Dan Rasmussen. I'm a freshman at the college. Earlier on in your speech, when you were talking about emancipation, it sounded as though you were saying that Lincoln kind of had freeing the slaves on his mind from early on in the presidency, and that he really initiated emancipation. But given three events, first, his first inaugural address, in which he, in essence, said this war isn't about freeing the slaves, and that's not at all what I want to do. Second, his refusal to allow generals who specifically requested the right to liberate Confederate slaves. And finally, the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation itself only freed slaves in territories which are not under Union control. Do you really think that his decision to sign the Emancipation Proclamation was one based on morality and principles, or was it more of a pragmatic decision based on military necessity?
Great way of analyzing it. You're absolutely right in everything you said. I mean, it is true that he, in his inaugural address, because most people in the North, all the anti-slavery orators, including himself, thought there was no power in the Constitution to do anything about slavery in the South. And he said, I'm not going to do anything about, and that was part of his way of hoping to hold the Union together by promising the South, I'm not going to take away from you a custom and a process that has been there that the Constitution protects. No question. That doesn't mean that in his mind he didn't think slavery was wrong, that he had always believed slavery was wrong, and wished that if there were some way to do it, but he couldn't think of how to do it at that point, clearly. Early on, yes, when the generals were beginning to free some of the slaves on their own accord, he was clear in his own mind that this is a decision only the president should make. So part of it was keeping his own authority to himself, and part of it was feeling the country's not yet ready for that. As I was saying earlier to David, he had to calculate what steps he could make depending on where the country was at. Then when he finally came to the decision that the country had to be ready for this because the Union would lose the war, so it was practical as well as moral when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the timing was right, he thought, at that point to do it. Even though it didn't free any of the slaves in the South, it's important to realize when you look, and some people look at that now and say it meant nothing as a result because the slaves were in the South, they couldn't be free anyway. He didn't free the slaves in the border states where he would have had power. He knew he didn't have the power to free them in the border states because they were on his side. Nonetheless, if you look at the response that it made, both in the country at large and in the black community at the time, it was big. The Emancipation Proclamation was not simply a political act. It was seen by people in the country as a morale booster for those who believed in the end of slavery and for the African American community in itself. And I think the best answer to the questions of those people who question whether Lincoln really did have slavery on his mind and whether he was open enough to really being considered a black leader is Frederick Douglass's relationship with him. Because at the beginning of the war, Frederick Douglass criticized him over and over again for all the things that you said, and rightly so. He hated his inaugural address. He hated the idea that he was preventing these generals from opening the doors to ending slavery. And yet he came to meet Lincoln in the White House. Lincoln openly wanted him to come there to talk to him. And Douglass said when he first met him that he was the first great white man he'd ever met that didn't condescend to him as a person. Now, he had met Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison and all the great abolitionists, all of whom he felt had somehow made him feel a sense of color. Lincoln did not make him feel that. And meanwhile, they worked together, and they had several other meetings. And at the end, Douglass gives a talk after Lincoln has died, way later, I think it's in 1876, and he understands, he said, if you judge Lincoln by an abolitionist standard, he's going to seem slow and tardy and indifferent. But if you judge him by the fact that he's president of all the people, and he has to care about that as a democratic leader, he's radical and forward and progressive. And I think that's the answer. He was president of all the people. He had to move step by step. He wanted to do this, but he had to wait until the North was ready for it.
Do you want to follow up on that, by the way?
No, that's
You want to debate that issue?
No, he's right. So there's no reason he's right. But then Lincoln understood what he was saying.
Thanks. Thank you. Two more. Yes, sir.
My name is Eric Weltman, and I live here in Cambridge. If Lincoln were around today, would he be a Republican? All kidding aside, if he were around today, where do you think he would fit on sort of the ideological, political spectrum? Where would he stand on some of the contemporary issues of the day?
Should we get, John, you want to give a response as a Republican for this?
I think it's impossible to know because the parties were so different then. I think what we do know about Lincoln, however, is that he believed the function of government was to do for individuals what they could not do so well for themselves. And he believed that the purpose of government was to lift artificial weights from all shoulders so that people could rise to the level of their talents and where their discipline would take them. And I think in some ways, both parties might claim that that's their standard. I mean, the Democrats would obviously argue that they believe that government has a role, a positive role, in doing for individuals what they cannot do so well for themselves. Republicans might claim that they are the party of equal opportunity and allowing people to move. Democrats would argue, but we're the ones that are trying to remove artificial burdens from their shoulders, like health care, like bad education. I think what he would be doing today would be to argue that when there's a democracy and when there's people who are not having an equal chance, I mean, his whole idea was that he had risen from, as he once said, from his father's son to become president of the United States, which showed that anybody could become president of the United States. He wanted to make sure that that opportunity was open to as many people as possible. He had never foreseen what the Industrial Revolution would do, what would happen to the Republican Party after the Civil War, when it would become the party of business. I mean, all of that was before him, so that's why it's impossible to know where he'd stand today. But those principles, I think, should still be guiding both parties, because that's what democracy is supposed to stand for. The idea that in this country people can come and have a chance to become what their talents and their discipline take them. And he'd be arguing that every single day. Any kind of constraint that was put on people that don't allow them to do that, I think he'd be arguing against that. He'd be great. We'll bring him back.
Last question.
I'm Ankur Shah, student at the Kennedy School, and thank you for bringing this all to life. I'm just wondering, given your experiences, whether you might contrast the leadership styles of Lincoln and Johnson, and given the conversation we just had about Emancipation Proclamation and means and motivations, and specifically with respect to their views on power.
I'd be glad to do that. I mean, I think what happened is when Johnson first took over after Kennedy was assassinated, he realized, I think at that moment, that he was being given an opportunity that at that point he never thought he would really have again, because once he was vice president and had lost the chance for the nomination in 1960, there was no real hope of his becoming necessarily the president again. And the extraordinary thing he did right after Kennedy died, the very first speech he made was to say there's nothing more important to Kennedy's legacy than the passage of the Civil Rights Act. That was an enormous risk at the time, because it meant that he was, in a certain sense, pegging his own presidency in that short period of transition before 1864 November, when he would have to run on his own right again, on the passage of a bill that many people thought would never get through the Congress, given that there'd be a filibuster, and given that if he failed, he had said, this is what I'm going to be doing for this period of time. And I think what happened is, as he set his mind on getting that bill through, and brilliantly knew how to do it. In fact, there is a moment when Lincoln is dealing with getting the 13th Amendment through the Congress where he used Johnson-esque tactics. I mean, it's incredible. He promises things. There's patronage. He's using all sorts of maneuvers. He raises money outside to make sure that everything is used to get it done. He reminded me of Lyndon Johnson at that moment in the small. But I think what happened to Johnson is that when he got that bill passed brilliantly, by understanding how to break the filibuster with Richard Russell, by having Hubert Humphrey as his main person on the Hill, he then felt such a sense of pride at knowing that he had changed history by ending segregation in that bill, that he then decided, people said to him, well, that's it, now you've got to be calm. And he said, no. The next year, even before Martin Luther King marched on Selma, he introduced voting rights into his State of the Union message. And he said, now is the momentum. I've got to use it. This is my chance. And I think civil rights got into his soul, and that when he wanted to be remembered, just as Lincoln wanted to, it would be for what he could do for civil rights. It was so real to him. And so then he gets the Voting Rights Act passed, and then people say to him, now you've got to stop. The country is got to mobilize, they've got to sort of absorb all of this. And then, even less popularly, he went for open housing. And then he, of course, famously said he knew when he signed the Voting Rights Act that that would end the Democratic control for a generation, because he knew that it would break the Democratic Party in two and lose the South. But I spoke to him not too many weeks before he died, and he told me even then that if ever he were to be remembered, he hoped it would be for civil rights. So I think what does combine them is the idea that somehow he was able to complete when we think about Lincoln having, and people criticize him when he said that he wasn't sure that the country was ready for full equality between blacks and whites, when he said that in the 1850s, well, it took a century before we were ready to get rid of segregation, before we were giving equal voting rights to black Americans. And Lincoln, in many ways, completed the revolution that Lincoln had started. So more than Lincoln could have dreamed, I think, when he is remembered by history, it will be for civil rights. And I know from those months and years that I spent with him at the end of his life, it was what mattered to him more than anything else. And I just hope that historians in the future will accord him the respect that he deserves. The war was a terrible thing. It cut this country in two. It ended the Great Society in many ways. It cut so much progress away. I was in that anti-war movement. I know what all that meant. In fact, my original relationship with Lyndon Johnson came because I was chosen as a White House fellow, was selected to go to a big dance at the White House, dance with him. He said he wanted me to work directly for him in the White House. But then, unfortunately, because I'd been in the anti-war movement, I'd written an article against him, which came out in the New Republic days after this dance, and the theme of the article was how to get rid of Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And I was certain he would kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So I did end up working for him that last year, accompanying him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs. And I must say, I will never forget that experience of having those hours with this aging lion of a man who had been a victor in so many conquests and yet roundly defeated by that war, so sad, so vulnerable in those last years of his life, and yet needing somehow to talk about what he had accomplished. And I know from that experience that civil rights was the most important thing to him before he died. So thanks for that question.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, please understand that Doris has a date with her family, that she's a very important event for her son. She promised she'd be in Concord by 8 o'clock tonight. So she's going to slip out of here fairly quickly. But in the meantime, Doris Kearns Goodwin, we thank you.
Thank you
so
very
much.
Thank you.